Britain is facing up to 20 months of Brexit delays amid a constitutional crisis after smirking Bercow invokes 400-year-old law to scupper PM's hopes of a third meaningful vote. John Bercow was accused of trying to sabotage Brexit last night after he blocked another vote on Theresa May's deal. In a dramatic intervention, the Commons Speaker ruled that the EU withdrawal agreement could not be put to a vote again without substantial changes. He gave Downing Street no notice of his announcement, which came just 24 hours before the Prime Minister was expected to ask the Commons to decide on the issue for a third time following two crushing defeats. As well as sparking a constitutional crisis, Mr. Bercow's move all but killed any prospect of a vote before Mrs May heads to an EU summit on Thursday. It also means she may have to ask Brussels for a delay of up to 20 months. A senior government source said the Speaker, who is an outspoken critic of Brexit, wanted to wreck Mrs May's plan of limiting the delay to 3 months. It seems clear that the Speaker's motive here is to rule out a meaningful vote this week, the source added. It leads you to believe what he really wants is a longer extension, where Parliament will take over the process and force a softer form of Brexit. Anyone who thinks that this makes no deal more likely is mistaken. The Speaker wouldn't have done it if it did. With just 10 days to go until Britain is scheduled to leave the EU, the Prime Minister was last night locked in crisis talks with her closest advisers to try to come up with a new strategy. Ministers proposed a string of radical options, including asking the Queen to open a new session of Parliament in the hope of getting round Mr Bercow's ruling. In a bleak assessment, Solicitor General Robert Buckland said, "We're in a major constitutional crisis here, a political crisis we want to try and solve for the country. The Prime Minister is doing everything she can to try to break that impasse. There are ways around this: a prorogation of Parliament and a new session. We are talking about hours to March 29th. We could have done without this. Now we have this ruling to deal with. It is clearly going to require a lot of very fast but very deep thought in the hours ahead." In a private message to Tory MPs, Brexit Minister Chris Heaton-Harris suggested the EU would exploit the chaos to demand a 5-year delay to the UK's departure, giving the Commons all the time in the world to steal Brexit. He added, "Game over," as Mr Bercow sparked further controversy by suggesting he might allow MPs to vote on soft Brexit options. Brexit Minister Kwasi Kwarteng told MPs that Mrs May would this week ask Brussels for a long delay to Brexit. Sources said the PM would seek a break clause to allow Britain to leave before the European Parliament elections this summer if her deal is approved. Mr Bercow, who acts as judge and jury on Commons rules, suggested a new political agreement with the EU or the promise of a referendum would be needed for him to allow another vote. Hopes that the DUP would swing behind the deal in the next 24 hours faded, with sources suggesting there would now be no breakthrough this week. Leading Eurosceptic Jacob Rees-Mogg, however, hinted he could back the PM, saying, "Mrs May's deal, however bad it is, takes us out of the European Union." government sources suggested a final attempt to get her plan through can still be made next week if the DUP and leading Eurosceptics come on board. EU sources suggested Brussels could delay a decision on extending Article 50 until March 29, the day the UK is due to leave. Commons leader Andrea Leadsom clashed angrily with Mr Bercow, accusing him of failing to treat MPs with courtesy and respect. Boris Johnson faced a backlash after savaging the PM's deal again. Mr Bercow's decision was welcomed by some Brexiteers, who believe it could bring no deal closer, and by supporters of a second referendum, who think it could result in Brexit being blocked altogether. Hardline Brexiteer Rowan Patterson said, "If the withdrawal agreement cannot be put to the Commons again, we must leave the EU on March 29, as the law demands." Labour MP Angela Eagle welcomed the ruling, saying it was wrong to allow MPs to be either strong-armed, bullied or bribed by the government into backing Mrs May's plan. But Mr Bercow enraged some mainstream Tories. Neil O'Brien MP accused the Speaker of double standards, pointing out that he had allowed multiple votes on plans hatched by Remainers trying to block Mrs May's strategy. And he warned that voters would not understand why MPs were being banned from voting on a deal negotiated with 27 EU countries. Mr O'Brien said, "If the Speaker were to block a solution, which many of my constituents favour, from even being discussed, on the basis of no principle other than his preferences, then my constituents will be furious with him. It is for Parliament to decide what it wants to do in order to respect the will of the British people, not for one man to decide what should or shouldn't be on the table." James Gray MP said, "Thanks to this announcement Brexit will not now occur. The people of Britain, the people who voted for Brexit, but also the Remainers who want to see democracy done, will be absolutely furious that their views will not be allowed to be heard in the House of Commons." Mr Bercow's ruling centred on the long-standing principle that MPs should not be asked to vote twice on the same issue in a single session of Parliament. He said he had allowed a second vote on the deal because it had changed after Mrs May secured fresh concessions from Brussels. But he added, "What the government cannot legitimately do is resubmit to the House the same proposition or substantially the same proposition as that of last week, which was rejected by 149 votes." Ministers pointed out that Mr Bercow had torn up Commons rules in January to allow Dominic Grieve, a Tory Remainer, to throw another spanner in the government's Brexit plans. Mr Bercow last night suggested he might let MPs use an emergency debate possibly as soon as this week to stage votes on soft Brexit options, such as staying in the customs union and single market. Votes on emergency debates are normally restricted to neutral motions. As Bercow sinks May's hopes of sealing EU deal this week, will Britain be in limbo for 20 months? By John Stevens, Deputy Political Editor. Theresa May will be forced to ask the EU for a long delay to Brexit after John Bercow yesterday wrecked her chances of getting her deal passed this week. MPs voted overwhelmingly last week to instruct the PM to ask Brussels for an extension to the two-year Article 50 process. Mrs May had said a short technical delay until June 30, giving enough time to pass necessary legislation, would be possible if her deal is passed before March 29. But if MPs do not back it, there would have to be a much longer extension delaying Brexit for up to 20 months, requiring the UK to take part in European Parliament elections in May. After Commons Speaker Mr Bercow yesterday ruled the PM could not bring her deal back to the Commons unchanged, Downing Street sources last night said it was very unlikely a vote on it would be held this week. Instead, they said Mrs May will write to EU leaders ahead of a Brussels summit on Thursday requesting a lengthy delay. Some Brexiteers yesterday rejoiced at Mr Bercow's decision, believing it has actually increased the chances of a no-deal Brexit because MPs will not stomach a prolonged extension. In a sign of their optimism, one group of Eurosceptics was even heard whistling the Great Escape theme in the Commons tea room. But if the EU agrees to offer the Prime Minister an extension, it is unlikely to be turned down by a Commons that voted against the no-deal departure. It means MPs now face a showdown next week, the last before March 29, when they are likely to be asked to vote on Mrs May's deal again if she wins the Speaker's permission, and if that fails, on the offer of a delay. It means that although the referendum was almost 1,000 days ago, Britain's future will go right down to the wire. Last night, sources suggested Mrs May could try to seek a break clause in any delays she negotiates at the European Council this week. That could potentially allow the UK to leave early before the European Parliament elections if MPs have a change of heart and approve her deal. If that attempt is unsuccessful, Britain faces up to 20 months in the EU while a new plan is negotiated. However, some Brexiteers are convinced that when presented with this prospect next week, the Commons may yet decline to formally approve a delay and that Britain will leave on time with no agreement. Mark Francois, deputy chairman of the European Research Group of Hard Brexit MPs, told BBC Radio 4's PM programme, the legal position is that unless something changes, under the EU Withdrawal Act that Parliament passed last summer, we leave on March 29 at 11 p.m. That has not changed. Mr Francois suggested no deal could happen if the EU refuses to give an extension to Article 50. He added, all 27 nations must agree unanimously. I am not saying for definite that they won't, but it is not axiomatic that they will. So it is a moot point and we will have to wait and see. Former Tory Cabinet Minister Rowan Paterson said Mr Bercow's decision was a huge opportunity for those who want the country to leave with no deal. He told BBC Radio 5 Live, if the withdrawal agreement cannot be put to the Commons again, we must leave the EU on March 29 as the law demands. That has huge support across the country, that would satisfy the 17.4 million people who voted to leave. It would satisfy all those conservative voters who were promised that we would leave the single market, the customs, the remit of the European Court of Justice, ECJ, and it would put real pressure on the EU to come to discussions on a free trade deal. He added, I think there is a lot of Project Fear nonsense about the so-called no deal. We have already got lots of side agreements on aviation, airplanes, trucks. I think what would happen is that it would trigger a really positive, constructive discussion. If an extension is agreed by the EU, Mrs May will have to bring it back before MPs just days before the country is due to leave the EU on Friday. Downing Street sources said they wanted it to include an exit clause the country can leave early if the Brexit deal is somehow passed by Parliament. Mrs May had planned to hold a third vote on her Brexit deal this week and had been hopeful she could win around the DUP, which are seen as pivotal because of their influence on Tory Brexiteers. Tory Eurosceptic Jacob Rees-Mogg yesterday said he would wait to see what the DUP decided before finally making up his mind which way to vote if the deal returns to the Commons. However, last night sources said there was no chance of a breakthrough this week in talks with the DUP. MPs last Thursday backed the Prime Minister's reluctant call to delay Brexit by 413 votes to 202. It came a day after they backed taking no deal off the table by 321 votes to 278. Me, and the twitchy windbag was at his despotic worst. Henry did see Speaker Bercow deliver exocet to Mrs May's Brexit strategy. John Bercow rose to his feet shortly after 3:30 yesterday afternoon. You could tell by his bodied language this was a moment he had been itching for all day. As he surveyed the chamber with that sense of propriety which has become his staple in the Speaker's chair, his face twitching with bristly anticipation, it was obvious this was to be no mundane procedural announcement. What spewed forth from his mouth for the next 20 minutes of rhetorical windbaggery was met with incredulity on all sides of the House. No forewarning had been given to any party what he was going to say. Prime Minister, the leader of the opposition, they were all hearing it, like us, in real time. Labour couldn't believe their luck. The government simply couldn't believe what it was hearing. If Mrs May's deal is to be put before the House for a third time, the Speaker ruled citing a Commons precedent from 1604, then it would have to be substantially different to the one MPs voted on last week. She could not simply ask members to vote on exactly the same deal. Bang! An exocet rocket straight to the core of what remained the Prime Minister's Brexit strategy. No wonder Bercow was smirking. Chief Whip Julian Smith was so stunned his lower jaw was hanging open. Someone on the front bench really needed to lean over and pop it back up again. Once again the government had been done over by the chair. Frustrating ministers and torpedoing Brexit. These are what get John Bercow out of bed in the morning. Rules? Procedure? The chap just seems to make them up as he goes along. The Speaker had been on unusually boisterous form for Monday moments before making his statement during pensions questions. He bantered with backbenchers. He joshed with his clerks. Plonked in the Speaker's throne, his stumpy legs hammered up and down his footstool excitably like a naughty toddler in a high chair. The news emerged he would be making a statement once the session had finished. It was swiftly obvious from his giddy behavior the little goblin planned to drop a howitzer on the government. The House quickly filled as MPs rushed to hear what he had to say. How he seemed to enjoy that. He then rose to feet, clutching a stack of paper half an inch thick. Oh heck, we weren't getting out of here in a hurry. was the Speaker at his despotic worst, putting himself at the centre of events and turning it into the John Bercow show, painting himself as Parliament's fearless defender. Part of the responsibility of the Speaker is to speak truth to power, and I have always done that. I have never been pushed around, and I am not going to start now. I am not a stickler for tradition, but His oration became so florid and absurd at one point, Works and Pensions Secretary Amber Rudd had to stifle her matronly giggles. The arch-Brexiteers were delighted. Sir William Cash, Stone in Staffordshire, congratulated the Speaker on his judgment, saying his decision made an awful lot of sense. Howe returned the compliment, praising Mr. Cash for always trying to act in the national interest. Priti Patel gave a beaming Cash a well-done pat on the back. "Pass the sick bag stuff.